People have different reasons for checking out new games. Sometimes it's the art style, sometimes it's the underlying genre, sometimes it's the promise of brutal difficulty. For me, the reason I gave the indie platformer Demon Peak a try was the following headline: fighting game inputs add depth to Demon Peak's aggressive combat. Anyone who's ever interacted with me probably knows that I am massively into fighting games, and I do enjoy the technical execution aspect of them. Not enough that you'd see me upload a combo exhibition video, but I do believe that complex motion inputs, like having to do a quarter circle for a fireball, are an important and fascinating part of their design. These inputs never established themselves outside of the fighting game genre though, which made it so curious to me that Demon Peak pushes them as its distinguishing feature. I asked myself beforehand, would a platformer actually gain something by including them? And after playing it, I can say I still don't know. Demon Peak is somewhat insubstantial, which is not really criticism when it only costs $5. This is not supposed to be a review. Yes, it had these inputs, but it didn't do much with them. They felt tacked on and not like part of the core design. But even with Demon Peak not doing the concept justice, after I was done with the game, my interest in the subject matter was piqued. And that's why in this video I want to explore this idea. At least on a theoretical level. Could platformers benefit from implementing fighting game motions? Let's find out. In order to understand if motion inputs could add anything to platformers, we first need to understand why they exist in fighting games. A little while ago there was a discussion going on about whether or not motion inputs are an archaic design that upcoming games like Dragon Ball FighterZ should get rid of. During that debate, the King of Fighters player Atma wrote a great blog post outlining part of their importance for game design and balancing. The argument Atma lays out here is that motions in fighting games limit players in what they can and cannot execute simultaneously. Motions consists of directional inputs, and with most input methods like pads or arcade sticks, a fighting game will only recognize one inputted direction at a time. The best known fighting game inputs are the quarter circle, down, down, forward, forward, and the dragon punch, forward, down, down, forward. Given that in most fighting games blocking is done by holding back or down back, a side effect of having to input these motions is that it is impossible to block at the same time. This then is important for mind games between players. The example Atma uses to explain this concept is the matchup of Ryu vs Fei Long in Street Fighter 4. Given that Ryu has a very strong fireball game, Fei Long might be interested in using his so-called chicken wing. The chicken wing move can travel over Ryu's fireballs, and even if Ryu ends up blocking it, will leave Fei up close where he has the advantage. Chicken wings however aren't invincible and can be beat out by most attacks before they hit the opponent, so Ryu's best option here is to use his Dragon Punch when he sees the chicken wing and thus counter it on reaction. This reaction requires a three-step process. Ryu needs to first understand when he is in a situation where Fei might use chicken wing, second, notice and recognize the startup of the move, and third, input the forward down down forward motion plus a punch button to execute the Dragon Punch. In order to react quicker and cut out the third step, Ryu can use an advanced technique called input buffering. When he expects the chicken wing is about to happen, he can constantly input only the Dragon Punch motion, forward, down, down, forward, but without the punch button. The game then considers Ryu's Dragon Punch motion as already inputted, i.e. buffered, and only requires the punch input to execute the Dragon Punch. It is pointless to throw out random chicken wings against experienced Ryu players because of input buffering, and the motion requirement is what makes it possible. However, given that Dragon Punches require forward and down motions, what Ryu can't do while inputting or buffering them is hold back at the same time. He is committing not to block. If Fei Long suspects this, he can now alter his play and use a different move, his so-called wreckers. These are fast forward moving punches that, if they catch Ryu while he's not blocking, damage him and throw him to the corner where Ryu doesn't want to be. So there's a constant mind game going on in the Ryu vs Fei matchup, all based on the fact that moves require motion inputs. Ryu wants to throw fireballs, which Fei could be expecting, and counter with a preemptive chicken wing, which Ryu could be expecting and punish with a buffer DP, which Fei could be expecting and counter with a wrecker, area, which Ryu could be expecting and counter by covering the space in front of him with a fireball, and we've come full circle. It's all based on outsmarting the other player, exploiting the fact that he has to commit to certain motions to do certain moves. There are countless examples of this in any character matchup, and it gives great complexity to fighting games. One big problem though, none of this applies to single player platformers. In that genre there's nothing to outsmart except AI enemies. Even in fighting games, playing against the AI has always been mocked by competitive players because it is always either stupid or cheating, either not reacting to what you're doing at all or reading your inputs and countering every one of them like a little bitch. There's no mind game going on when one side is a computer that can input anything he wants without physical or mental restrictions, so the limiting aspects of committing to motions to outsmart the other side falls apart. This design aspect of fighting games cannot be applied to platformers. Let's mark this as a negative and move on to the next point. Another argument for motion inputs in fighting games are input times. Fighting games usually run at 60 frames per second, and if you take something like a Dragon Punch motion that consists of 3 individual directions, forward, down, down, forward, this means players need at least 3 frames to input the move. That's the theoretical optimum. In practice, I asked multiple friends, all serious competitive fighting game players, to input a Dragon Punch in a game with a frame counter, and it took them 10 frames on average, 8 if they really tried. Casual and non-fighting game players would take even longer. Again, fighting games run at 60 frames per second and every single frame counts in them. A tenth of a second is do or die here. The fact that a Dragon Punch is restricted by a relatively complex Z motion and takes a moment to execute gives extra weight to that move, which makes sense considering that Dragon Punches are strong, invincible attacks. This is also why most command grabs in fighting games like Zangief's Piledriver require a 360-degree motion. And even in Street Fighter V, which drastically steered away from execution barriers, most comparable moves still need at least a half circle. Command grabs like the Piledriver are literally unblockable and deal huge amounts of damage, so you want people to be restricted in how fast and how easily they can get these out. Would that design concept matter for a platformer? Yes, I think so. What if, for example, instead of a normal jump, you had to input a Dragon Punch midair to gain extra height? Guacamelee did something like that, but without the motion input. Or what if a platformer required you to react to certain incoming attacks, except this time, instead of avoiding them with, say, a dash done by a single button press, you'd have to input a Dragon Punch motion instead. That would certainly raise the mechanical skill ceiling and make it more challenging, as the Dragon Punch takes longer to input and the timing window would get tighter. And of course, getting used to the motion would also make it easier again, rewarding practice. One could even add optional depth with motion inputs, for example by treating them like Ryu in Smash Bros. 4. Here Nintendo included the normal versions of his moves with the typical direction plus B inputs, but players can also choose to do the actual motions for powered up versions. Offering a lenient normal version to use in the beginning could ease in the player. The stronger, more time-consuming move you get with proper motions would be there for those who are ready for advanced techniques. And towards the later areas, when the game is supposed to ramp up the difficulty, usage of the stronger moves could be softly enforced by level and enemy designs, while also challenging you on your input speeds. So if handled correctly, this could work. I'll mark this as a potential positive. A noteworthy distinction between fighting games and platformers is the general movement. Fighting games are mostly played on a flat plane with characters automatically facing each other. Pressing back in a fighting game results in the character moving backwards. Pressing back in a platformer results in the character turning around and moving into that direction. This might sound trivial, but it is a huge deal considering that in a fighting game you don't have to worry about falling off the edge of a platform. Smash notwithstanding, but Smash also doesn't have motion inputs. Shut up. This means that aside from staying away from the corner, walking back for half a second in a fighting game isn't a big deal. In a platformer, however, it might just be the one input that literally pushes you over the edge. Movement and positioning are important in fighting games as well, but on a different scale, one that doesn't include precision jumping and avoiding multiple enemies or projectiles. That's why platformers usually give you multiple ways to adjust your jumps and steer your character in in midair, while even in fighting games with a lot of air movement, you usually only get 1 or 2 jumps with predefined arcs and an equally rigid air dash option. A lot of moves in fighting games are specific to the ground because jumping and running in those games are commitments. Meanwhile, in a platformer, jumping and running are the game. They are what you do at any given second. Both of these genres approach movement in very different ways. That in turn means motion inputs have to be approached differently as well, since they consist of inputting directions, and inputting directions causes movement. When you are supposed to input a half circle on a platform that leaves you very little room to maneuver, that could pose a problem. Same with edging out motions while also trying to avoid multiple projectiles, a situation much more common in a platformer than it is in a fighting game. Another problem is that the base walking or running speed of most platformers is way higher than that of most fighting game characters. You want your platforming character to have fast, fluid movement after all. A simple forward input within a motion could lead to you traveling way farther than you wanted or than you are used to from fighting games, messing up your platforming even further. None of these problems seem insurmountable, but at least on a theoretical level there's a lot of friction when trying to apply fighting game inputs to platformers, just because of how differently these genres handle movement. A potential advantage of using motion inputs over simple ones could be the access to more moves while using fewer buttons. Platformers that don't feature complex inputs, like Rayman, tend to bind one ability to one button, or have certain abilities be contextual to environmental triggers. Considering that 2 buttons are usually reserved for jumping and attacking, a normal controller has about 6 buttons left. Add a dash or roll and maybe 1 more ability on top of that and you're already out of face buttons. Trying to add anything beyond that, a super attack, different types of projectiles, some air movement options, a shield, a parry, or anything else would take up an extra button with not that many left on the controller. At some point the game designer will be forced to restrict ability access by utilizing a loadout function or a radial menu. Adding motions to a platformer could change this. Quarter circle, dragon punch, half circle, back forward, down up, down down, these are among the most basic inputs you'll find in modern fighters, and already we got 6 different ways to utilize a single attack button. In a platformer this would probably take care of most needed attacks already and could free up the rest of the controller for any other task, like movement, blocking, dodging and so on. Demon Peak used this motion input idea in a particularly neat way. It had a light and a heavy attack button, and moves like the Dragon Punch could be done in either a light or a heavy version depending on which attack button you pressed after the motion. Both moves had different properties and mana requirements, so you couldn't just spam the heavy version all day, and that made combat deeper and more complex as the player had more moves to work with. Accessibility however wasn't hurt by this, since both the light and the heavy version operated off the same motion input and the player didn't have to learn anything new. So move variety could be massively impacted by motion requirements. I'll say this is a potential positive. Another unique thing about motion inputs is that you can fuck them up and drop them. This might sound banal, but it is absolutely vital to fighting games. Dropping a guaranteed combo because of a sloppy input on your part can easily cost you a round or even a game. Additionally, fighting games often let you choose how difficult you want your execution to be. This can happen by picking either a low or high execution character, using advanced techniques, or choosing between various combo routes, some that are easier to pull off and some that are harder but also lead to other advantages like better damage, corner carry or positioning. You also have to factor in high pressure situations. Fighting games are played competitively. Being on a grand stage in a top 8 match with thousands or tens of thousands of people watching can be nerve-wracking. That pressure hits your technical abilities for sure. Even pros drop combos in this setting, even in low execution games like Street Fighter V. The fact that combos can be dropped means that players who have really practiced their motions and have nerves of steel will be rewarded by landing damage in a clutch moment. Having good execution gives you a competitive edge over other players, and that's great for fighting games, at least when you're an avid competitor, but what about single-player platformers? Would people appreciate it in that genre too? It stands to reason that fighting game players in a competitive environment have a much different mindset than someone playing a platformer at home. A big part of the appeal of complex inputs in a competitive fighting game, and the subsequent danger of you dropping them, comes from the knowledge that your opponent might drop them too. And whoever doesn't screw go up is proving to be the better player, at least on a mechanical level. This aspect does not exist when you're facing off against an AI that isn't in danger of dropping anything. Where competitive players might revel in proving to be the best, players at home do not have to prove anything to anyone but themselves. That makes it seem a bit unlikely that they'd actually appreciate part of the difficulty coming from the mere act of trying to execute moves, and pressure coming from the fact that they might screw them up. Especially since fighting game inputs aren't widespread, their addition could make them seem more like a potentially frustrating gimmick than a design choice that adds depth. And here we arrive at the biggest question mark of this video. I can go on and on about the theoretical advantages and disadvantages of motion inputs, but I also have been playing fighting games for upwards of 15 years now. My view is extremely biased in the sense that the execution aspect is normal to me, which is what made me check out Demon Peak in the first place. A lot of people, however, struggle with getting deeper into fighting games because of this execution barrier. So aside from asking if motion inputs could improve platformers, we also need to ask if players would even want to put up with them. Motion inputs could be handled in very different ways, well or poorly. You could keep them basic or complex. Your platformer could feature extensive tutorials and a fighting game style practice room for people to get used to them. You could make a traditional platformer focused on movement and jumping and utilize motion inputs only occasionally for extremely impactful super moves. Or focus more on combat and emphasize fighting game like spacing and countering with only occasional platforming, like the upcoming Okinawa Rush. Either way, a unique platforming design doesn't matter if the game pushes players too far and they become unwilling to learn the required skill set in the first place. That is what's most important. That would be the crucial difference between a motion input platformer being compelling only for already established fighting game players and a motion input platformer with actual widespread appeal. Which of these approaches is the right one? I'm afraid I don't have the answers to that. Players and game designers will have to decide. All I can say is, I would love to see experiments like Demon Peak more often. Bouken, signing out. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm glad I got it out way quicker than the previous one. And you know, what I said at the end there wasn't just some bullshit. I'm genuinely curious what you guys think of this topic. Do you guys play fighting games? And if yes or if no, would you like to see these inputs in other genres, or do you think they would probably just ruin whatever they're in? Either way, let me know in the comments on this video, or you can also write me on Twitter. I'm super active on there, and my Twitter handle is @BoukenJima_. Also, please feel free to like and subscribe to my channel. I have at least one more video coming up this year. It's gonna be my Game of the Year video, and I'm really looking forward to that because this has been a pretty fantastic year, and I'm gonna have a lot of nice things to say about some games that I didn't get to make any videos on. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Also, I want to give a shout out to Corvus Analyzes. He has been helping me a lot with this video by giving a bunch of important feedback during the process, and you can find a link to his channel in the description below. He does a lot of long form video game analysis and his videos are really good, so you should definitely check them out. And yeah, otherwise I hope to see you on my next video, and until then, bye bye.